initiating central control and opening diagonals for queen and bishops immediately. Immediately challenging the center, knight occupies a prime outpost, preparing to contest the central squares and hinting at dynamic play. Asserting central influence and initiating queen's pawn game, white aims to control the core and prepare for pawn advances. Embracing the king's Indian defense structure, this prepares a fianchetto to contest the long diagonal, potentially sacrificing central pawn control for active piece play. Developing the knight to c3 reinforces the central pawn and prepares to castle, aiming for a solid, active position. Fianchettoing the bishop establishes excellent diagonal control, a hallmark of the king's Indian setup, and supports potential kingside castling. Central pawns clash, opening lines and challenging black's fianchetto setup for a dynamic struggle. Solidifying the center's pawn structure, d6 supports the e-pawn and prepares to develop the queen's bishop, creating a robust defensive setup. Solidifying the center further with f3, white prepares for a kingside pawn storm, but it does subtly weaken the light squares around the monarch. A safe haven secured, the king retreats from the central storm brewing, anticipating white's ambitious pawn thrusts. Solidifying the central pawn structure and preparing for piece development, white aims to control key squares, particularly d5 and e4, while keeping the e3 bishop actively positioned to influence the kingside. Solidifying the knight's presence in the center, this placement aims to support future pawn advances and potentially offer a safe haven should the kingside come under pressure, while subtly challenging white's e-pawn. The bishop repositions, offering protection to the f3 pawn and preparing to contest the crucial d-file, a subtle yet important shift in the piece hierarchy. Challenging white's central pawn chain, this move immediately injects dynamism by targeting the d4 stronghold and opening diagonal avenues for the queen. Initiating a rook lift to g3 or h3 for a kingside assault becomes the immediate plan, aiming to exploit the kingside pawn structure black has committed to. Liberating the center's tension, black exchanges a central pawn for improved piece mobility, aiming to activate the queenside while white's kingside castling feels somewhat exposed by the f3 pawn. Capturing the pawn opens the bishop's diagonal, aiming to secure central control and develop attacking pressure on black's kingside setup, while potentially isolating the knight on d7. Reclaiming central influence, this knight boldly occupies the strategically vital e5 square, challenging white's pawn structure and opening avenues for further piece deployment. Castling on the kingside securely tucks the monarch away, aiming to consolidate white's central pawn structure and prepare for potential queenside expansion. Unlocking potential on the queenside, this advance prepares to challenge white's central grip and aims to seize greater queenside space, potentially opening lines for a pawn storm or a knight outpost. Securing the king's safety from potential diagonal threats on the g1 square offers a vital breath of fresh air for white's monarch, anticipating any future pressure along the h-file or the dark squares, while simultaneously preparing for a more active central pawn push or piece development. Solidifying the knight's outposts and preparing a more active piece deployment, this bishop repositions to a more flexible diagonal, aiming to influence the center from a safe distance and potentially support a queenside expansion. White endeavors to seize dominion over the queenside, preparing to challenge black's queenside pawn structure and potentially open lines for attack. Asserting control over the open c-file is a logical progression, as this file will likely become a primary battleground in the ensuing middle-game skirmish. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure while eyeing control of the b-file represents a cautious, yet potentially powerful, strategy aiming to restrict black's queenside expansion and prepare for future central maneuvering. This knight's repositioning cleverly prepares to challenge the central pawn structure and potentially exploit the slightly compromised light squares around white's king. White aims to solidify control over the central dark squares, particularly e4, while potentially preparing for a queenside expansion or a central pawn break later on. This repositioning of the bishop from d3 to e3 subtly alters the defensive structure, reinforcing the king's diagonal and freeing up the d3 square for another piece, perhaps a knight, in a future maneuver. The bishop's migration subtly highlights white's intention to avoid immediate pawn tension and instead focus on a more nuanced, prophylactic development, awaiting black's next strategic clarification. Observe how this seemingly passive move contributes to a harmonious piece coordination, a hallmark of solid positional play, aiming for long-term structural advantages. By retreating, the bishop avoids being directly challenged on the d3 square, allowing white to maintain flexibility and not commit to immediate pawn exchanges in the center. A subtle yet important step, this prepares to liberate the dark-squared bishop and potentially contest the central e4 square, offering a much-needed pawn structure adjustment and aiming to improve the knight's prospects. Securing the open file, the rook's repositioning heralds an intensified struggle for central influence and potential attacking avenues along the c-file, aiming to disrupt black's harmonious piece development and exert pressure on the queen side. The knight's bold leap to the edge of the board at a5 aims to disrupt white's queenside control, seeking to exchange itself for the potentially problematic bishop on d4 and alleviate some of the pressure black has been experiencing in the center. It's a dynamic maneuver, introducing an element of uncertainty and forcing white to reconsider their pawn structure and piece coordination. This move, while seemingly passive to some, is a nuanced attempt to improve black's piece activity and create counterplay on the queen side, potentially opening lines for the rook on c8. Unleashing a pawn storm on the king side, white immediately seeks to create attacking chances, prioritizing aggressive expansion over the immediate consolidation of central control. A bold pawn thrust by white, 16. f4, now black's knight lunges to g4, seeking to exploit the potential weaknesses created on the king side. This aggressive repositioning aims to disrupt white's harmony and potentially create tactical fireworks, eyeing squares like f2 and h2. It's a commitment to active counterplay rather than passive defense, recognizing that white's structure, while solid, might be susceptible to a well-timed knight raid. The knight's new outpost promises to put pressure on white's king and may force concessions. With the knight on g4 a glaring target, white cleverly redirects the bishop to h2, aiming to untangle the queen side and potentially prepare a kingside expansion, while also keeping an eye on the vulnerable d6 pawn and the open e-file. A sharp, almost desperate attempt to break open the center, this pawn thrust immediately creates tactical possibilities, but also weakens the dark squares around black's king significantly. Shifting the bishop to b1, white signals a potential repositioning, aiming to free up the c-file for potential operations or perhaps to eye the queen side after a future pawn advance. This offers a subtle but important positional adjustment, acknowledging the dynamic nature of the central tension and the queenside pawn structure that black has diligently built. The bishop's retreat avoids potential enfilades and prepares for a more flexible defense or even an eventual counterplay on the flank. This commitment to establishing a strong queenside presence with the queen offers black a crucial resting place and prepares for potential pawn advances, but it neglects the immediate tactical danger brewing around the kingside. A strategic pivot, aiming to redeploy the knight to a more active square and potentially prepare an f5 push, bolstering the center and gaining space on the kingside. This repositioning hints at a desire to connect the rooks more fluidly and exploit the currently unassigned squares, offering a fresh perspective on white's attacking potential. Consider the long-term implications of freeing the g-file. It could become a powerful avenue for rook penetration should black's defenses falter. This maneuver is not about immediate confrontation, but about a subtle enhancement of piece placement, subtly improving white's coordination and readiness for future advances. It's a tempo gain, allowing the knight to escape the pin on the e-file and find a more commanding role in the upcoming skirmishes. The repositioning might also be a preemptive measure, anticipating black's potential pawn storm or piece activity on the queen side. Observe how this change might alter the pawn structure dynamics in the center and on the king side, influencing piece exchanges and mobility. White is essentially saying, my knight was a bit passive. Now let's put it to work where it can truly influence the game. The rook embarks on a journey, potentially aiming to solidify the f-file or join the fray on the queen side, a patient maneuvering that might surprise white's already committed pieces. The bishop retreats to d3, a rather cautious repositioning that seems to prioritize solidifying the central pawn structure over immediate threats or aggressive maneuvers, perhaps aiming for a long-term build-up before committing further. Unleashing the queen with this aggressive advance, black seeks to exploit the light squares around white's king and create immediate attacking possibilities, though it risks overextension and leaves the queen potentially exposed to counterplay if white can weather the initial storm. Finally, a bit of breathing room for the white king. This retreat of the bishop from the aggressive diagonal after black's bold knight maneuver and subsequent queen penetration effectively shores up the kingside defenses and reestablishes a more solid pawn structure. It acknowledges the immediate tactical threat without sacrificing long-term positional integrity, offering a chance to regroup and contemplate a counterthrust. Black's advance of the h-pawn, while seemingly aggressive, opens potential weaknesses around the kingside, creating an intriguing tension between activity and king safety. This pawn push might aim to gain space or prepare a future g5 thrust, but it simultaneously weakens the light squares and potentially exposes the king to counterplay along the g-file or even the diagonal. Shifting the bishop to the rim now opens a diagonal for the queen, but simultaneously abandons control over the central dark squares, potentially creating weaknesses that black could exploit with a timely pawn advance or knight maneuver. Seeking to activate that dormant bishop and challenge the e4 pawn, bf8 nudges into a more dynamic square, aiming to support a potential kingside pawn storm or even find sanctuary on the newly opened diagonal. Recapturing the knight with the g-pawn now is a key decision. White could also opt to develop the queen's knight to a more active square, perhaps c3 or d2, considering the central pawn structure and the potential for queenside expansion. Recognizing the potential for disruption, black maneuvers the knight towards the center, seeking to contest the d4 pawn and potentially open lines for attack later. This repositioning subtly alters the pawn structure's dynamic, hinting at future central skirmishes. Opening the c-file for the rook could be intended to contest it, or perhaps it's a preparatory maneuver for a later advance on the queen side or even a rook lift. A critical repositioning is underway, shifting the rook from its defensive post to potentially contest the e-file, a crucial avenue that has remained largely inactive. This maneuver hints at a desire to activate the black army's heavy pieces and create more dynamic play, perhaps aiming to disrupt white's centralized pawn structure. The rook's journey signifies a shift in focus from the queenside skirmish to the central battlefield, where control of open or semi-open files will likely determine the game's complexion. Consider the potential for a future exchange on the e-file, which could alleviate some of the pressure on black's king and open lines for counterplay. The subtle readjustment prepares for a more active role, aiming to seize initiative rather than merely reacting to white's development. Preparing to challenge the d-file, white repositions their rook to a more active square, aiming to exploit potential weaknesses along that central pathway and support future advances. Black's bishop scurries back, a strategic retreat to reinforce the queenside and prepare for a potential kingside pawn push. Securing the king's safety by creating an escape route is a prudent decision, especially with the opponent's pieces actively probing the queenside and center. This maneuver on h7, while seemingly passive, aims to reinforce the king's shelter by preparing for potential pawn advances or providing an escape square should the queenside defenses crumble. The queen's repositioning here aims to escape the potential pin along the newly opened h-file, while simultaneously preparing for a more active role, perhaps on the kingside, and also eyeing the weak pawn structure that black might develop on that side of the board. Seizing an active outpost for the knight at b4 suddenly sharpens the battle on the queen side, challenging white's central pawn structure and threatening to disrupt the harmony of black's pieces. Suddenly shifting focus, white reroutes the queen, a subtle maneuver to potentially bolster the queenside presence or perhaps support a pawn push on the file. The queen now retreats, seemingly abandoning the d7 bishop's protection and setting up shop on a square that blocks her own knight's potential advance to c4. This creates a significant positional dilemma, potentially allowing white to seize the initiative along the open files, especially the c-file, while black's pieces remain somewhat disconnected. Aggressively clawing for territory on the queen side, white's pawn push immediately challenges black's knight and aims to restrict its influence, while simultaneously creating an outpost for a rook on the 7th rank should the opportunity arise. Reclaiming initiative with this knight's repositioning aims to challenge white's control of the central files and potentially disrupt their queenside expansion. This pawn advance opens a crucial file for the rook, aiming to activate it and potentially pressure black's queenside pawn structure, while simultaneously creating a defensive retreat square for the king should complications arise. A subtle repositioning aimed at untangling the knight from its recent skirmishes and seeking a more active square, potentially eyeing the queenside or even a central infiltration once freed. Unlocking the queenside through a pawn sacrifice creates intriguing complexities, aiming to exploit the compromised pawn structure after the preceding exchanges. Trading this knight eliminates a crucial defensive piece that was preventing white's pawns from advancing and potentially opening lines toward black's king. While it simplifies the position, it also grants white a more open center and the possibility of developing an attacking initiative on the king side, especially as the g-file might become exploitable. Black needs to be vigilant about the increased pressure on their position. Recapturing the bishop on d4 aims to restore pawn structure and open lines for counterplay, but it ignores the immense pressure building on white's kingside and the exposed position of the monarch. Seeking to untangle the knight from its pin and activate the queen, black repositions for a potential queenside expansion, though the knight's retreat concedes valuable central influence and frees white's bishop to eye the long diagonal. Striking the knight on f5 suddenly opens the e-file, directly challenging black's now exposed king and aiming to exploit the weakened dark squares around it. Opening the kingside for counterplay now, though it weakens the pawn structure. Unlocking the f-file for rook penetration seems to be the underlying idea, aiming to stir up activity on an otherwise static queenside. Unleashing that pawn forward creates a fascinating tactical tangle, directly confronting the light-squared bishop and opening a potential avenue for the queen to infiltrate down the h-file, though it simultaneously weakens the king's pawn shield. Unleashing the knight to d5 injects immediate pressure, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and pry open lines towards the king, potentially creating weaknesses around that vulnerable h4 pawn and its allies. A critical juncture. The bishop's relocation to g7 aims to bolster the kingside defense, a seemingly natural response to the advancing pawn storm, yet it risks neglecting central control and leaves the d-file somewhat exposed to future pressure. Trading off the knight here, while perhaps seeming natural to simplify, opens up the king's defense and potentially grants black's queen more influential squares. Preserving the bishop's influence and reinforcing the kingside defense becomes paramount after the exchange on f6. The altered pawn structure now presents both opportunities and potential weaknesses for both sides. Opening the f-file, this recapture aims to disrupt black's defensive structure around the king, potentially creating weaknesses for future advances. The recapture of the pawn reopens the queen's influence on the kingside, aiming to exploit the slightly exposed black king and potentially challenge white's centralized pieces. Sacrificing the queen on d6 opens lines for the rooks and bishop, aiming to exploit the exposed black king and create mating threats. Initiating counterplay with the rook, black desperately seeks activity before the queenside collapses. The queen's excursion to b8 creates an immediate and uncomfortable pressure on black's queenside pawns, particularly the c6 knight, hinting at potential tactical sequences. Attempting to untangle from the pin on the g-file, the rook retreats, hoping to regroup on the d-file, but this passively places it on a square where it's still quite vulnerable to future pressure, especially if white can open the center further. Snatching that pawn immediately opens the b-file, potentially creating a dangerous outpost for the rook and putting pressure on black's queenside, while simultaneously weakening the pawn structure around the black king. Reclaiming the bishop, Black sacrifices material to disrupt white's imposing queen presence and aims to untangle their pieces, though the king now sits exposed in the center. Seizing the isolated pawn provides an immediate material advantage, but the resulting queen activity on an otherwise quiet board demands careful calculation to prevent counterplay. A daring attempt to inject some chaos by sacrificing the queen for immediate material gain, hoping to overwhelm white's position with the connected pawns. Snatching the pawn on a 6, white seizes a material advantage, but simultaneously opens up the file for black's rook, and potentially creates a passed pawn for the opponent on the queen side if black can manage to advance it. This aggressive pawn grab might prove too costly if white's king becomes exposed, or if black can generate counterplay along the newly opened lines.